is a former Auditor General for the Commonwealth. John McMillan is not only a former Ombudsman, but he's also a former Information Commissioner. We've seen in recent times the Federal Ombudsman do some wonderful work. Leppington Triangle would be unknown to any of us, except for the work of the Federal Auditor General. Sorry, I think I might have said Ombudsman before. Yet the government's cutting back the funding for the Auditor General. Meanwhile, the Information Commissioner was set up as a response to try and find a faster and cheaper solution to the problems created under the Freedom of Information scheme. It's under-resourced and it's become overwhelmed because of the incredible number of redactions which the Commonwealth will put in place to try and prevent information coming to light. The Centre for Public Integrity would like that to stop. It doesn't just want it to stop, it wants it to be reversed. So we're going to ask Ian McPhee and John McMillan to give us their views on these important issues. Ian speaking first. Ian, who's an officer in the Order of Australia, was in the Australian Public Service for 44 years. He started in the Auditor General's department. He ended spending his last 10 years as the Auditor General. In between, he'd gone to other places, it's true, but he finished where he started. And with Easter coming up, I guess the religious people would remember that it said that from dust we came, to dust we shall return. The thing is that he's got a wonderful reputation and he continues to enhance that by his work since his retirement from the public service. Ian, would you like to talk to us about your experience as the Auditor General and where you think we might do things a little better?
Thank you, Geoffrey. Thank you for your kind introduction and your very considered introduction to today's seminar. It's very good to be with you and with everyone else online. Yes, I did start as a cadet auditor in the early 70s, and who would have thought that I would become the Auditor General in 2005 through to 2015. But it was a great career, and the other thing I should say is I did spend quite some time with the finance department too in various executive roles there. So I had a great career and enjoyed it very much. The Audit Office and the Auditor General, I think, are very special roles and do a really important function in this country. And for that reason, the Auditor General is given considerable independence in charting the work of the office and in delivering reports to the Parliament in terms of both financial statements work and also performance work. The reports obviously assist the Parliament to hold the executive government to account and inform the wider Australian community about the integrity of public administration at the federal level of government. Part of this role, of course, involves assisting parliamentary committees as well with their work, and they do value the perspective of the Auditor General and the Australian National Audit Office. It is the case, as in many countries, executive government in Australia has access to significant resources and, of course, to the capacity of the Australian Public Service. So officers like those of the Auditor General and Ombudsman assist in keeping the Parliament informed about the state of public administration. So they are a key role to assist the Parliament in its role of holding the executive government to account. The recognition given to the importance of the role of the Auditor General and the integrity of government finances was understood from the very early days of our federation. In fact, the Audit Act was the fourth act of the Commonwealth Parliament. It followed the passage of two supply bills and the Act Interpretation Act. So right up there in the start of the legislative program. And the other thing I might add, just for completeness, is the Australian National Audit Office, with a different name but same function, is one of the few government bodies that goes right back to the times of federation. So a pretty important role. Geoffrey, I don't know whether you'd like, I'm happy to talk a little bit about how the legislation has evolved over time, if you would like, or I'm in your hands, but I can talk a little bit more about the fact that I think the audit legislation has been kept up to date and current to allow the Auditor General to perform effectively in the interest of the Parliament.
You're the expert here, Ian.
So,
and people don't, in my experience, wish to hear any more from me than they need to. I'd rather let you.
Okay, well, let me go a little bit further, because I think it's important to understand in the early days, the legislation was focused on government finances. And in fact, I think there were some amendments passed in the early days to allow the Auditor General not to have to audit 100% of government transactions, to allow sampling to take place. So it's a sign of the times. But in the more recent times, a key additional responsibility the Auditor General was given was to do performance audits, or as they were initially called, efficiency audits. In 1979, a very substantial change to the legislation. There were other changes to provide the Auditor General to undertake assurance reviews, which aren't audits, quite a lower level of assurance, but important to allow reviews of topics like the top 30 defence projects, to do comparisons of how the various projects were going and performing against budget and schedule and capability. So reviews of that kind, and more recently and importantly, follow the money powers, which enable the Auditor General to conduct performance audits of state and territory entities that receive Commonwealth funding, where there is a corresponding or reciprocal responsibility to deliver specified outcomes at the request of the Minister or the JCPAA. So those follow the money powers of state government entities can be undertaken, but at the request of the Public Accounts Committee or the responsible minister. But in the same vein, the Auditor General can use the follow the money powers in the areas of performance auditors of contractors that are engaged to assist in the delivery of Commonwealth programs. So again, stretching the Auditor General's responsibilities. In that case, the Auditor General does not rely or require the request to come from a minister or the Public Accounts Committee. So my point, Geoffrey, is the legislation, understandably, has evolved over time, but I think is contemporary and appropriate as a mandate for the Auditor General. Now, there may be some areas at the margins, but fundamentally, it's in pretty good shape. The other thing I'd like to say is that the Auditor General has got broad access powers to information created by government, and the ability to take oath on evidence relating to his or her responsibilities. And this is terribly important. It allows the Auditor General of the day to get on with their role without concerns about access to the relevant information and to get the job done. So this legislation certainly gave me confidence to undertake the role of Auditor General to the best of my ability. It allowed me to take evidence in the rare cases on oath from ministers, even prime ministers, if I considered that was appropriate in the circumstances. So just to perhaps capture some broader perspectives, the reports of the Auditor General, certainly in my time, in Grant Hare's current time, in my predecessors' times, have certainly stimulated positive changes for better outcomes. They've brought serious matters to the attention of Parliament for further consideration and generally further review by parliamentary committees. And so they are an important mechanism for both accountability, but also to get better outcomes in the interest of the citizens of this country. the reports have been very much focused on highlighting areas for remedial action, and also in more recent times trying to convey broadly to public sector agencies some messages of relevance coming out of individual audits, but of relevance to the system as a whole. There have been many reports, and we could talk about a lot of them, but fundamentally it is about enabling, assisting the Parliament to hold the executive government to account. There's some very good stories as well. Sometimes we just hear the negatives, but I have to say there's some good progress and programs being managed by a range of Commonwealth entities. And I sometimes think we focus a little strongly on the negatives, but there's a lot of good work done to overcome problems in the community interest as well. So I think, Geoffrey, happy to leave it there. Happy to talk broadly about resourcing of the office at some stage, and in that I'll bring to bear my experience both as the Auditor General, but also some of my prior experience in the finance department as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to come back in due course, and I want to press you on just a couple of issues. Well, I'll ask John to speak before I do so, but just to warn you, I'm going to ask you about some of the matters that you framed in terms which suggested that the current powers were ample. I want to put power to one side and then say the finances, whether they're ample as well. And also, I just want to perhaps get a little bit more clarity about what can be done and should be done in terms of those things you described as efficiency audits. So that's a warning to you, Ian, that I will come back to you. In the meanwhile, could I introduce to you all Professor John McMillan, also an officer in the Auditor of Australia. Professor McMillan's background is a little more diverse. He actually started life as a legal academic. He was a professor of law at the Australian National University, teaching administrative law and constitutional law. As part of this, John actually was one of those people who pressed for the creation of our Freedom of Information scheme, the statutory scheme. In due course, I'm going to ask John some questions about that, because he spent, I just don't have the number written down, how many years it was. You might tell us, I think it was 5 years as the Commonwealth Ombudsman, but also 5 years as the Commonwealth Information Commissioner. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great Australian who's about to speak to us, who was not only there at the creation of some of our transparency and accountability agencies, but some of them were his idea. Professor McMillan, you take it over from there.
Thank you, Geoffrey, and particularly for those flattering remarks. My commendation to the Centre for Public Integrity for holding the seminar. I, like Ian, I actually, early in my career, I worked in the office I later headed. I worked in the Ombudsman's office for nearly 18 months at an early stage of my career, and then was Commonwealth Ombudsman for 7 years and acting New South Wales Ombudsman for nearly 3 years. Now, my comments today will focus on three matters: the diverse nature of Ombudsman officers, the important practical role they play in government accountability, and how their accountability function can be reinforced. And I will take that broader perspective, because when we are talking about how to protect these agencies, it's important to know what we're talking about and why we should protect them. And I fear I'm going to go longer than Ian and take the 20 minutes that I was allocated, but I'll keep it in that. Well, I'll start by noting that Ombudsman officers don't have the same long ancestry as other accountability bodies, such as courts and auditors general, though the Ombudsman institution traces back over 200 years to Sweden, the first office in our region, and among the first in the world, was in New Zealand in 1962 and WA in 1971. But developments in the subsequent 50 years have been extraordinary and match, if not outstrip, developments in other areas of oversight and dispute resolution. Public sector ombudsman offices now function in each Australian jurisdiction. There are corresponding private sector ombudsman offices that oversight areas such as telecommunications, finance, health services, energy supply and transport. A plethora of specialist investigatory bodies that draw from the Ombudsman model have been established with titles such as Inspector General of Intelligence and Security and Taxation, Commissioner for Aged Care and the like. And the size and intricacy of offices has flourished as well. For example, the Commonwealth Ombudsman now has over 220 employees. The Tasmanian Ombudsman is also the Energy Ombudsman, Health Complaints Commissioner, Information Commissioner, Custodial Inspector, and Official Visitor. And the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, the largest, is headed by a Chief Ombudsman, supported by 32 other ombudsmen, 17 adjudicators, and more than 600 staff that handle 80,000 complaints annually that relate to the 40,000 plus businesses that are registered with AFCA. And there have been similar developments internationally. The International Ombudsman Institute now has 190 member offices in 90 countries. Several countries or regions have their own ombudsman or ombud associations that play a regulatory role through accreditation, standard setting, and training. And in states that have adopted new or revised constitutions, it's not uncommon that the Ombudsman is now given a constitutional footing. Now, this historical chronicle indicates how the Ombudsman concept has, in a sense, broken free of any original or more limited understanding of what an Ombudsman's office is or does. Indeed, a familiar remark that's made whenever systemic troubles are exposed in any zone of public life or bureaucracy is that we should consider establishing an ombudsman mechanism to prevent a reoccurrence. And a recent interesting example is the recommendation of the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry that an ombudsman be established to resolve complaints and disputes with digital platform providers such as Facebook and Google. And not surprisingly, governments sometimes use this strategy to reassure the public of their commitment by badging new officers with an ombudsman title, even though from a doctrinal perspective, the office doesn't easily fit the description. And ill-fitting examples are the Fair Work Ombudsman and the Small Business Ombudsman. Though the Ombudsman concept and mechanism is now difficult to define in any purist way, there are common themes that stand out that explain the promotion of Ombudsman initiatives. And I'll identify three in particular. The first is that dubbing a body as an Ombudsman is designed to convey a message that the body will be independent. Now, in a practical sense, an ombudsman is independent if appointed for a fixed term with the discretion to investigate as he or she thinks fit, is not subject to direction from any other officer, and has an unhindered right to speak publicly and to publish the results of investigations. The second message is that an ombudsman type office will be able to accept and investigate complaints from members of the public. And the complaint procedure is expected to be informal, without charge, and possibly allowing anonymous complaints. The third message is that complaint investigation will be guided by a philosophy that the Ombudsman does not represent either side to a dispute, will listen to both sides, will make evidence-based findings, has no stake in the outcome, and has adequate investigation powers. Now, those three principles or promises are probably embedded in practice better in some ombudsman type offices than in others, but the principles nevertheless capture the narrative that is advanced whenever a new mechanism is proposed. Now, let me stand back from that more academic framework and describe some of the practical ways in which ombudsman officers play an important public sector accountability role. The first is obviously through individual complaint handling. The public sector ombudsman together receive upward of 120,000 complaints annually. And that complaint activity sends a message to public servants that anything they do can be complained about and investigated by an independent office. And the ombudsman, through looking constantly and unpredictably at what government is doing, is a constant reminder to officials of their need to act lawfully and with integrity. And this can help build a culture of integrity within government administration. Indeed, history teaches that minor administrative discretions, delay and indifference, rudeness and prejudice, sloppy information gathering will, if left unchecked, take root and become systemic and malign problems in government. And a familiar story is that errors as minor as misspelt names or incorrect addresses or dates of birth lead to wrongful arrest, prolonged detention, or destruction of private property. Indeed, in a contemporary setting, the government warnings about COVID risks caused by parties that transpire to be non-existent are a salutary reminder of the damaging social consequences that can happen when governments get basic facts wrong. The other dimension of complaint investigation is that the ombudsman will sometimes do a major report, such for example, on an own motion basis on matters as diverse as unlawful detention, conflicts of interest, fines administration, homeless accommodation, visa processing, and the like. A good recent example of a powerful own motion report was the Victorian Ombudsman report that the timing of the lockdown of 2 Melbourne public housing towers to control a COVID-19 outbreak violated Victorian human rights laws. The Ombudsman reported that the lockdown was rushed, contrary to health advice, and caused confusion and severe deprivation for numerous public housing tenants. An equally powerful report of the Victorian Ombudsman back in 2018 found that 21 ALP members of Parliament had misused their parliamentary budget entitlements for expenditure on party political campaigning. Now, if I reflect personally on Ombudsman reports that I published, there are two investigations I would highlight. One was an investigation in 2005 to 7 of 247 immigration detention cases that resulted in 8 reports that covered legal issues, record keeping, computer errors, mental health, and children in detention. The reports identified legal and factual errors in nearly all 247 cases, including the detention of 26 Australian citizens and improper detention that lasted up to 6.5 years in one case. And I think the 8 reports fed into a major program of administrative and cultural reform in immigration. And more recently, in 2016, as Acting New South Wales Ombudsman, I completed an investigation titled Operation Prospect that examined allegations and complaints that were either about or connected to a covert investigation into serious police corruption that was conducted 15 years earlier by a joint crime commission and police task force. Controversy had surrounded that corruption probe for more than a decade and caused a damaging split in the New South Wales police force. The Ombudsman investigation at the request of government spanned 4 years, examined over 1 million documents, examined 131 witnesses over 89 days, was the subject of constant media commentary and criticism, faced 2 Legislative Council inquiries, produced a 900+ page report faced litigation to prevent the tabling of the report, and was also the subject of 2 follow-up reports to Parliament when the New South Wales Crime Commission refused to accept the report findings. Now, the investigation is a salutary reminder of the challenges that can confront ombudsman and oversight bodies in investigating complex, controversial and embedded disputes. However, I'd also like to think that the episode demonstrates the effectiveness of this work, as this particular controversy has now gone away and is largely forgotten in New South Wales. And indeed, an ironic twist is that my successor as New South Wales Ombudsman, Michael Barnes, is now the head of the New South Wales Crime Commission. The complaint and investigation work of the Ombudsman is supplemented by a range of other functions and activities which now show the diversity of the modern offices. Many offices administer public interest disclosure statutes. They receive whistleblowing disclosures, monitor agency investigations, set the investigation standards, promote the scheme and do annual statistical reporting. Some offices still perform the same role in relation to FOI. Many ombudsman offices have an inspection or official visitor program, for example, to visit and speak to people in centres of imprisonment and juvenile justice, immigration detention and supported accommodation. The Commonwealth Ombudsman is the national monitor to examine Australia's performance in implementing a UN optional protocol, OPCAT, that aims to reduce the likelihood of mistreatment in places of detention. Some offices have a compliance auditing role, for example, to conduct periodic inspections of the records of intelligence and policing agencies to ensure they comply strictly with the detailed laws that cover telephone interception, electronic surveillance and the like. New South Wales and WA Ombudsman convene a child death review team of community and medical specialists to register all child deaths and identify causes and patterns. And though roles, executive coordination roles of that kind are atypical, there's strong stakeholder support because the Ombudsman is regarded as a knowledgeable and trusted office that has a demonstrated record in assisting vulnerable communities. It has a commitment to transparency and no explicit or hidden agenda. And then, of course, there's all the other work to promote better practice in complaint handling and good administration through training, forums, brochures, fact sheets and the like. Now, I'll finish my presentation by noting 3 broader structural issues that address the points Geoffrey outlined at the beginning and that warrant consideration to reinforce the Ombudsman's accountability function. And these issues are equally as relevant to other oversight bodies. The first is that we have now have a rather crowded oversight environment. There is a wide and uncoordinated range of mechanisms for grievance handling and dispute resolution. We partly see this in the random way that the oversight bodies are described, but at a more fundamental level, we haven't examined systematically how oversight bodies relate and link to each other. A simple example, the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Commission can each investigate complaints against the other and also against the Information Commissioner, who can likewise handle FOI and privacy complaints about the other 2. Now, this uncoordinated multi-agency framework now supports an industry of disputes about disputes. And in my time, it's appropriate to conduct a general review and updating of how the numerous oversight bodies link together as a vital element of a government accountability network. And possibly that could be done as part of the discussion of the creation of a national integrity system reappraisal. Secondly, we should examine the formal relationship of oversight bodies to the Parliament. One path to consider is a formal statutory declaration that the Ombudsman, like the Auditor General or like the Victorian or ACT Ombudsman, is an officer of the Parliament. Now, there are differing views on whether a mere declaration of that kind would be symbolic only, but there are practical ways of supplementing it. One is to enact, as the New South Wales Ombudsman recently proposed, an Officers of Parliament Act that provides standard conditions on appointment, removal, staffing, budgeting, information sharing, and executive independence. Another practical option is to establish a dedicated committee of the Parliament, much as the Auditor General reports and has a special relationship with the Joint Committee of Public Accounts and Audit. There are other precedents, for example, in the Commonwealth, the Joint Committee on the Australian Commission for Law Enforcement Integrity. In New South Wales, the Committee on the Ombudsman, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission and the Crime Commission. And in Victoria, the Parliamentary Integrity and Oversight Committee. And the third issue is whether there should be a special parliamentary mechanism to ensure that bodies such as the Ombudsman, Auditor General and ICAC receive adequate funding, or at least they don't face a recurring threat of defunding. An inquiry into this issue is currently underway in the New South Wales Parliament by the committee I mentioned. The current practice for most oversight agencies in Australia is that their annual budget proposal is submitted as just another element of the annual appropriation proposal put forward by their portfolio department, usually the Prime Minister or Premier's department. In that context, the Ombudsman's proposed budget, like ICAC's and Audit, is sort of massaged and traded against competing priorities in that portfolio. There's great interest in the New South Wales inquiry, and generally now in Australia, in a New Zealand practice whereby the Ombudsman and similar agencies submit their annual budget proposal directly to an Officers of Parliament committee. And that committee conducts private hearings with the oversight bodies. It seeks Treasury advice on government budgeting criteria, and then it reports to the Parliament, and the Parliament separately considers the oversight budgeting proposals prior to considering the government's overall proposed budget. A similar practice was introduced in Victoria in 2020, whereby the budget of Ombudsman, IBAC and the Victorian Inspectorate will be considered by the Parliamentary Integrity and Oversight Committee prior to Parliament's consideration of the government's budget. So there'll be great interest in seeing how that goes. Geoffrey, Ian, that's my comments to contribute to the seminar, and I'll hand back to you at this stage.
Thank you very much for that, John. What I want to take up with both of you, I warned you about this, Ian, is that both of you were very persuasive in terms of the sufficiency of the powers of the different officers. But everyone will have heard that John just spoke about a topic which he spoke about and described as adequate funding. I want to start with you, Ian, because there was a recent parliamentary inquiry. I'm not sure whether you were asked to participate in it. I know that the Centre of Public Integrity was. I gave evidence with Dr. Williams to the Senate committee involved, and I might say they were intelligent, well-informed and well-meaning people on that committee, but it was dealing with the adequacy of funding. I listened in to the evidence of the current Auditor General, and I was disturbed to hear that he regarded the only way that the office could respond to, but now the same thing will be happening in the area of the Ombudsman, and I know that the same has occurred in the area of the Information Commissioner. Do you have any comments about that kind of issue, Ian McPhee?
Thanks, Geoffrey. if I can just give a little bit of background, when I was Auditor General and it came to funding, the approach adopted was when we got new financial statement audit clients, the office would get additional funding for the financial statement work. And that seemed to work quite well. So when we lost clients, of course, it meant there was a funding reduction, and that was reasonable because symmetry was applied to the funding approach. But when it came to performance audit, it was more treated as the bulk of the rest of the office and clearly subject to the usual efficiency dividend and other arrangements. So I can understand that over time, without access or without much access to new policy opportunities, how the office budget could come under pressure. And without being close to and not involved in giving evidence to the parliamentary committee or understanding their thinking, and reflecting on your earlier comments, I do wonder whether an approach to budget funding could also take into account not only the views of the Audit Office, but of the Public Accounts Committee with its oversight responsibilities about having a benchmark approach to funding a certain number of performance audits rather than see the numbers reduce over time because organisational funding reduces. I think there's a number of ways this could be addressed, is my point, Geoffrey, and the role is too important to allow this to become a significant issue in public administration in Australia. So I would very much encourage the responsible parties to get together and come up with viable options for consideration.
Could I just add to that?
Geoffrey, may I just comment briefly? Oh, sorry. If it may just comment briefly on that. All right, thanks. I suppose one of the, over time, a lot of the oversight, there's been controversy about this quite a lot. There are different strands in it. One of the first things I learned as Commonwealth Ombudsman is that simply complaining about funding wasn't going to get you any funding. You had to come up with other strategies of, demonstrating benefit, joining other workers, sort of catching the wave. It was here or there, and as I say, the office is now 3 times the size it was when I started back there in 2003. But what is uncomfortable at the moment is that there is no clear procedure for an oversight body to deal with this other than as just another government agency, and so that's why I have an open mind about how effective devices such as the New Zealand and Victorian proposals are, but I think they have the great merit that at least it's a defined procedure that will be followed in putting forward ideas, so that you don't have to have these backroom conversations about what's going on here or there, or how is this being viewed. And I think it's just an example of how our oversight framework has grown in such a complex and sophisticated way that we've just never stood back and taken stock of new issues that have to be addressed, given the result, given the framework we now have.
Well, that picks up nicely what I was about to insert as a comment upon Ian's observation. The idea that each of the agencies, whether it's the Ombudsman, the Information Commissioner, or the Auditor General, is the best person to make a judgment about how much money they need or how what they should be looking at in terms of funding. Well, that's pretty common. Should that remain in the hands of politicians, especially given the capacity that those agencies have at any time, potentially, to embarrass politicians and political parties? Putting it another way, what would you think about the appointment of an independent body which would make that assessment. Now, before we go further, don't think that that's something radical. For example, we have an independent body which tells us how much we should pay judges. One of the reasons being it shouldn't be in the hands of the politicians, given the separation of powers, to work out what judges are paid. So we appoint an independent body to do that. What do you think about that as an idea? I'll get you, because you're informed on that question, to answer it first, John.
Look, in one sense, I accept the reality at the end of the day that the government is responsible for, the budget under constitutional, putting it to the Parliament under constitutional arrangements, and that there's a degree of jockeying and self-interest in the process. Ombudsmen are no different. And Auditors General, in one sense, are no different to courts. Courts have to go through the same thing. I always found it, interesting. The comment was often, made to me, "Oh, well, the Ombudsman's not really independent because it gets its budget from its funding from government." I said, well, so does everybody else. The High Court is no different. But it's interesting that that is a clear perception issue, and I think it's very important to try and develop a procedure of the kind I mentioned, so that there can be an open presentation of ideas, and it's not subject to perceptions about the body's been cut back because of its last unpopular report or something of that kind. My view is that the oversight bodies will be very responsible in putting forward proposals to an independent, joint party committee of the Parliament. I think they're realistic about the broader budgetary environment, and so if there is a defined procedure where their ideas go separately and receive separate consideration, recognising that ultimately the government's going to have the control over it. I think that's better than what we've got at the moment.
But before I get Ian to respond, I just want to make an observation of my own, if I may, and then add a consideration for Ian. The observation is simply this, that I'm afraid there is a perception. There has been a recent cutback on the Auditor General's budget, and it followed closely after the Leppington Triangle revelation. In New South Wales, people will have noticed that recently ICAC had its budget cut, and I'm afraid that just follows hot on the heels of having the Premier called to give evidence at it. Now, I don't know that the events are related, but I can tell you this much. It causes disquiet, and certainly gets people drawing, rightly or wrongly, that connection. Ian, I make that comment, and if you take it into account, could I also add this, that I did hear the current Auditor General give his evidence, and I think it followed closely what you had to say. They had a target in mind of the number of agencies they were dealing with, or as they call them, their clients, and also they had a target number of audits. And he pointed out, not all of them were dedicated to trying to find out where things went wrong. He regarded it as a positive aspect of his work to find out where things have gone right, i.e. to make a positive comment and to get people to build on it. Would you mind taking those matters into account and address this difficult issue of independent funding?
Thanks, Geoffrey. And I think it is a case of looking at the options to see if we can get better outcomes than we've received to date. I don't have any problem with that. There's just two things I would say in defence of the current system. Firstly, the Auditor Office, Australian National Audit Office, used to be in the finance portfolio years ago and was shifted to the Prime Minister's portfolio to provide a bit of distance from the finance portfolio and to allow the Auditor General, as appropriate, access to the Prime Minister. And secondly, the Public Accounts Committee now has a formal reporting responsibility to both houses of the Parliament on the budget estimates for the Australian National Audit Office. So it goes to the model that was being progressed was this oversight of the Audit Office resources and to allow the committee to report to the Parliament. And it touches on what John was saying. whatever, whether you have a separate oversight body or whatever, somehow you still have to link into the government's budget processes and or the Parliament's perspective. And certainly from the earlier consideration, the Public Accounts Committee was given that role in relation to the Australian National Audit Office. So there was consideration given to this to give support to the independence of the position. There's obviously options to be able to progress that further and to see whether the system can be further improved. My observations from the UK experience is the Public Accounts Committee is a little more influential in terms of articulating the budget for the National Audit Office in the UK. And so it's just a question of whether we could give the Public Accounts Committee, whether we could use with the same framework we've got today, but maybe strengthen the authority of bodies like the Public Accounts Committee when it comes to certainly the resources of the Australian National Audit Office, and as John was saying earlier, potentially some other bodies as well that would be subject to further consideration. But the only thing I'd say, Geoffrey, and I'm not disagreeing, I just say every organisational structure has benefits and downsides, no matter what you do. And the goal has to be to maximise the benefits and compensates for the negatives. And the system we have isn't too bad, but it looks like it would benefit from a review, both in terms of the way the funding model that's used for the structuring the budget of the Australian National Audit Office, and then the oversight mechanism to maybe give more horsepower to the Public Accounts Committee in terms of the budget of the Australian National Audit Office, and potentially, as John was saying, some other organisations as well.
Well, there's a thing that was raised by John, which has always intrigued me. I know that the Auditor General, the Commonwealth Auditor General, is an officer of the Parliament. And John, as I understood what you had to say, you were suggesting there may be, in fact, some benefits or detriments associated with that being the general scheme. Could you explain to me why, when, in theory, an ombudsman or an auditor general should be independent of Parliament, that there's any advantage in also making them an officer of Parliament? Perhaps, Ian, you go first.
Yeah, well, John, I think, raised the question whether it's symbolism or more than that. The reality is, and this is quite unusual, the Public Accounts Committee can veto the government's recommendation for the person to become Auditor General. So it's a very powerful authority that's given to the Public Accounts Committee when it comes to the appointment of the Auditor General. So I think it's more than just symbolism, and it really was meant to bring home. It's actually in the hands of the Parliament, the Committee of the Parliament, rather than the government, which is kind of unusual, as you know, to allow for executive government to allow such power and authority to be outside of their normal realm. So I think certainly it brings home, it really brings home the nexus between the Auditor General and the Parliament, and the importance, and I never, it was always in my mind, the importance of my role in informing the Parliament and to allow the Parliament to hold executive government to account, etc. So for me, it was a powerful force for the independence of my role and the quality of the work we needed to do.
It's fascinating. John,
yes,
could I ask you your views?
I've had mixed experience in dealing with Parliament and parliamentary committees, and so I've never been a strong advocate of the officer of Parliament proposal, although I've sort of come around a bit lately. I've reported to parliamentary committees that sometimes showed indifference to what you're doing because they were gripped by other things happening within the parliament, and I've reported to committees that sometimes took a great interest. In the early days, for example, I established ACLI, and there was a specialist committee there, and that made a real difference, establishing a relationship with a committee that took a real interest. But I suppose I've come around to having stronger support for the idea for two reasons. One, I think it is now a way of defining what the location of these bodies is in our governmental system, and raising other issues. As I say, if you define a body as an officer of Parliament, the next question is: are you going to have an act that defines what this means? Is there going to be minimum standards that have to be met for a body to get this definition? Is there going to be a parliamentary committee to which you report? So I think the Office of Parliament proposal draws us into that very important debate. And secondly, at the federal level in Australia, the separation of powers thinking is so rigid and influential that commentators always think, well, where do you fit? And as to the Ombudsman and the Information Commissioner and everything, I said, well, you're clearly not part of the courts, you're clearly not part of the Parliament, so you're an executive agency. And the moment they describe you as an executive agency, then they think you're subject to direction and control and influence like any other executive agency. Now, the Office of Parliament proposal is one way of counteracting that. The other way of counteracting it has been the proposal that's got quite a deal of academic interest and support of sort of dubbing a fourth branch of government, an integrity or oversight branch, that we kind of lump these bodies in there. Now, it's more a debating point than anything else. But I think the Officer of Parliament proposal does open up this discussion that has to be held.
Well, the thing is that based upon my experience of going down to Canberra and speaking with politicians and attempting to launch a National Integrity Commission, the chances of establishing a fourth branch of our government, well, it's not going to happen in my lifetime. We're near the end, and I want just to draw an example here, which I think is an important one, and it's a good crossover between the two of your skills and experience. You're probably aware that there was a controversy over the value for money when the Australian military purchased Hawkeye troop carriers. And what had happened was that the purchase had been made, whether it was a superior or inferior product was one issue, whether it was a good or bad price was a key issue. The matter was reviewed by the Auditor General, who produced a report. When that report was produced, he produced it to the Parliament because he is an officer of Parliament. It was taken into the Attorney General's office and portions of it were redacted. And the claim was, in that instance, partly to do with national security, but that was hardly the case. That could barely be sustained. But it was also partly because it was commercial in confidence. Now, this involves both the Auditor General, and you've had plenty of experience there. It involves freedom of information issues. John, you've had tons of experience there. Can you tell me I should tell you what the punchline is. The matter went through the normal channels, Information Commissioner, where I think it was ordered that the whole of the report be released. The Commonwealth took that to the AAT, and the AAT made findings adverse to the Commonwealth, saying that it should be released. I'll just pause there and say the person who fought to do this was Senator Rex Patrick from South Australia, and he in the end secured it, and it's been released. And it was a bad purchase. It wasn't value for money, and it's the sort of thing which, as a taxpayer, I really wanted to know. Now, given the crossover there between the Office of the Auditor General and the role of freedom of information, the Information Commissioner, and other transparency issues. Would either of you wish to comment upon that case? John, you go first.
Can I just comment on the general principles? I'm not particularly aware of the case, but certainly my view has always been that the power to make a public comment or public report is an essential element of an independent oversight agency power. It's a power that comes with a great responsibility. You know, you have to be sensible and recognise that there are genuine secrets and confidentiality considerations, and so you've got to get along with the rest of government, and you've got to have an open mind. And allow them to put a proposition to you. But if it comes to a point where you are quite sure of your ground, then the Ombudsman Act, for example, has a formal procedure where the Attorney General can issue a public interest certificate that prevents the Ombudsman from publishing something. And on a couple of occasions when there was a long-running dispute with an agency about what could be said, I said to them, well, get the Attorney General to issue a certificate to me, and I'll respect that certificate. Now, it never got to that, obviously. So having formal procedures of that kind that often aren't used is a really good mechanism for calling a bluff, or for at least for taking it down, taking the dispute down a defined and principled path.
Ian.
Geoffrey, similar to John, look, in my experience, I never had that situation where the Attorney General got involved in changing anything within the report I proposed to table. But it was not uncommon to have conversations with people about, with agencies about information that was commercial in confidence or confidential. And in many ways, unless it was central to the audit conclusion, by adjusting some words, that could be addressed. Same with legal professional privilege. It was the practice where some of our reports we used to quote extensively from legal advice to government, and it was pointed out that from time to time there were some issues with that. And if it wasn't material to the conclusions, if it was just part of the story, the background, the context, then I was willing to see if we could lift it up a level to avoid the specific issue of concern about privilege or confidentiality or commerciality. So that's the way I worked. And as I say, in my experience, and it covers a lot of the experience of the Audit Office, it was very rare indeed for the Attorney General to get involved.
It's good to hear, but I'm not so confident that that will be retained. Well, that's our time is up. Anybody who's listening to this, you've just had the benefit of listening to two, not just genuine experts. I'm saying this, putting it right out there, two genuinely great Australians. These are two people who have preferred to serve us as great public servants rather than serve themselves. Anything they say is gold. You know, John and Ian, we get a tremendous benefit from people like you still staying in the mix and assisting us with understanding our institutions, and better than that, how to improve them. Thank you. Now, if the applause has died down, I'm just going to say one last thing. We're here from the Centre of Public Integrity. If you don't follow us yet, you should start following us now. We're available on Twitter, Facebook. I don't even know how to do most of these things myself. But the thing is, we're there. We are interested in promoting integrity, transparency, and accountability. Please rest assured, we are not party political. We never discuss that at our meetings. I'd like to say we're terribly partisan because we're very strongly in favour of what we believe in. But if you keep in mind that integrity, transparency, and accountability aren't bad things, come along for the ride. I'm calling it off now. John and Ian, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.